The Alpha King never misses his mark. And the Midnight Rebel was finally trapped at the edge of a jagged cliff. Snow tore across the mountains in violent spirals, stinging my face as I advanced. Behind her, the abyss yawned wide and merciless. Around us, my warriors lay scattered in crimson-stained drifts, their blood freezing into the white earth of the frost peaks. The moon hung swollen and bright above the carnage, an unblinking witness to justice long overdue. She stood defiant even then, silver hair wild in the storm, velvet garments dark against the snow, breath coming in fierce clouds. Her blade trembled but did not fall. I disarmed her in a single ruthless strike. Steel met flesh as I pressed my sword to her throat. One swift motion. One final decree. The rebellion would die with her. Then it happened. The bond ignited. It struck like silver lightning through my veins, stealing the air from my lungs. Her scent, silver birch and frost fire, wrapped around me, ancient and undeniable. My wolf roared in recognition, not rage. She lifted her eyes to mine, and the universe shifted. How do you execute the one person your soul has already claimed? Chapter 1. Winter in the Frost Peaks was not a season. It was a siege. The mountains did not simply exist. They endured. Jagged ridgelines cut through a sky the color of steel, and the wind howled without mercy, dragging curtains of snow across the earth until the world became nothing but white fury and shadow. Each breath burned the lungs. Each step threatened to swallow a warrior whole. Frost crept into armor seams, into marrow, into thought itself. And still we hunted. For 3 relentless weeks, the Royal Guard carved a path through blizzard and blood. We followed shattered encampments and frozen fire pits, tracked boot prints that filled with snow moments after they were made, and counted our dead in silence. The Midnight Rebel left no banners behind, no symbols carved into trees. Only disruption. Only defiance. And bodies. I rode at the front of the column as I always did. An alpha does not send his warriors into a storm he will not face himself. My name was Orion Veilblood, and the Frost Peaks bowed to my rule. They said I had been born during a blood moon. That my first cry had shaken the rafters of my father's war hall. That my wolf had emerged early and larger than any in living memory. Legends grow around leaders like ice around stone. I never cared for them. Legends do not win wars. Discipline does. Snow gathered along the fur collar of my armor, settling against the dark leather etched with the sigil of our pack. Beneath it, steel plates bore the scars of past campaigns, claw marks, blade strikes, dents hammered back into shape. My shoulders carried more than armor. They carried law, tradition, the weight of every oath sworn by those who bent the knee to me. Broad-shouldered, battle-scarred, unyielding, revered. I had earned both. The tracks veer east, my king, one of my captains called over the wind. I did not turn. I had already seen them. A faint disturbance in the snow. A subtle compression too deliberate to be natural. She moved swiftly even in this terrain. Clever enough to double back. Clever enough to split her followers into smaller units to confuse pursuit. But not clever enough to escape me. She's heading toward the upper ravines, I said. My voice carried without effort. It always did. She wants the narrow passes. Fewer angles of attack. And more places to ambush, the captain muttered. A faint curl of satisfaction touched my mouth. Let her try. The Midnight Rebel had become a phantom story whispered around low fires. A masked insurgent draped in midnight velvet and steel, striking supply routes, freeing prisoners sentenced under pack law, sabotaging council storehouses. She moved like smoke and vanished before dawn. Some called her a criminal. Some called her a savior. I called her a threat. Pack law was not a suggestion. It was survival. We lived in a world that devoured the weak. Unity was not optional, it was enforced. My father had taught me that as he taught me to wield a blade. Compassion without structure bred chaos. Chaos bred extinction. And yet the rebel dared to challenge that order. Worse, she inspired others to question it. Villages we passed through bore the signs of quiet rebellion. Not open defiance, not yet. But hesitation. Averted gazes. Murmurs that stilled when my guard approached. I saw it. I catalogued it. I would not allow it to spread. The rebel dies by my hand. I had sworn it before the full moon assembly, before the elders and warriors alike. No trial. No exile. Execution. An alpha who allows defiance to fester invites civil war. The wind sharpened as we climbed higher into the frost peaks. Snow struck like thrown knives. Horses struggled, their flanks heaving. We abandoned them before the ascent grew too steep, continuing on foot in disciplined formation. Below us, the valley stretched vast and merciless, forests reduced to skeletal silhouettes beneath ice. Above, cliffs rose like the ribs of some ancient beast. She's bleeding, another guard observed quietly. I crouched, brushing gloved fingers against a faint crimson spray frozen across the snow. Not much. Enough. A flicker of reluctant respect stirred in me. She had taken a hit and kept moving at this pace. Most would have slowed. She adapted. She won't risk stopping, I said. Not with us this close. A younger warrior hesitated before speaking. My king, there are whispers. There are always whispers. He swallowed. They say she fights for the lower ranks. That the food tithe this winter. I rose slowly. The wind seemed to hush. The food tithe, I repeated evenly, was increased because the harvest failed. Because we prepare for winters harsher than this one. Because survival demands sacrifice. Yes, my king. Rumors. Always rumors. That she fought not for chaos, but for reform. That she had seen children starve in the outer territories while council storehouses remained guarded. That she had once stood within our ranks. That she knew our strategies because she had been trained in them. I had dismissed the speculation as fear-seeking narrative. Rebels become more dangerous when mythologized. It makes them harder to kill. But as we pressed forward, cutting through another abandoned campsite half buried in snow, I studied the remnants she left behind. No unnecessary destruction. No slaughter of innocents. She targeted infrastructure, supply chains, authority. This was not the work of a mindless insurgent. It was strategic. The storm thickened by dusk, forcing us to take brief shelter beneath an overhanging ridge. The men huddled around shielded lanterns, speaking in low tones. I stood apart, watching the horizon disappear behind a veil of white. Fear and reverence followed me in equal measure. My warriors would march into certain death at my command. They trusted my judgment without question. That trust was sacred and heavy. A captain approached, snow clinging to his beard. We intercepted one of her scouts before the storm worsened. Alive. He nodded. Bring him. The scout was young, barely more than a boy. Blood crusted along his temple where he'd been struck. Defiance burned in his eyes despite the ropes binding his wrists. I studied him in silence long enough for unease to creep across his expression. You follow the midnight rebel? I said. He lifted his chin. I follow hope. A murmur rippled through the nearby guards. I silenced it with a glance. Hope, I repeated. Is that what you call theft? Sabotage? Treason? I call it survival, he shot back. You sit in stone halls while villages freeze. The air shifted. I stepped closer, towering over him, my shadow swallowing his smaller frame. Choose your next words carefully. His breath trembled, but he did not look away. She fights because no one else will. Because the council takes and takes. Because you do not see what happens beyond your war table. Something cold slid beneath my ribs. You presume much. She was one of yours, he said before fear could stop him. Trained in your guard. She believed in you once. Silence crashed down heavier than the storm outside. I dismissed the guards with a flick of my hand. When we were alone, I crouched before him. What is her endgame? I asked quietly. He hesitated. I leaned closer. Understand this. I will find her. Whether you speak or not changes only how much pain you endure before that inevitability. His jaw tightened. Then, softer, almost reverent, he whispered, She doesn't want your throne. She wants you to see. Rage flared hot and sudden. I stood, turning away before instinct could drive me to violence. Secure him, I ordered as the guards returned. He will stand trial. Trial. The word tasted strange in my mouth. For him, not for her. The storm eased by dawn, leaving behind a landscape remade in brutal beauty. Sunlight fractured across ice, blinding in its brilliance. Every surface glittered like shattered glass. Fresh tracks cut across a high ridge. Close. Very close. The Royal Guard moved with renewed focus, tightening formation. Weapons were checked. Signals exchanged in silence. I felt it then, a shift in the air. Not scent. Not sound. Instinct. She was near. We crested a rise and found the aftermath of a skirmish. 2 of my outer patrol lay fallen, throats cut cleanly. Quick deaths. Efficient. Anger coiled tight in my chest. She was here less than an hour ago, my captain confirmed. I straightened slowly, scanning the terrain ahead. The mountains narrowed into a series of jagged passes leading toward the highest cliffs of the frost peaks. Trap. Or desperation. Either way, it ended soon. She thinks the storm weakened us, I said. She underestimates our resolve. And you, my king? I met the captain's gaze. I do not underestimate her. That was the truth of it. This was no ordinary insurgent fleeing blindly into winter. She calculated risk. She sacrificed strategically. She struck symbols of power, not civilians. Even now, she lured us upward where numbers meant less. A worthy adversary. Which made what must be done all the more necessary. The higher we climbed, the thinner the air became. Breath fogged thick and fast. Snow gave way to sheer ice in places, forcing us to anchor lines and move carefully across treacherous ground. Then we saw her. A distant silhouette against the blinding white, standing still at the mouth of a narrow pass. Cloaked in midnight, silver hair catching the sun like drawn steel. She did not run. She waited. A murmur rippled through the guard. I felt my wolf stir beneath my skin, restless and alert. Hold formation, I commanded. We advanced. She vanished into the pass. A calculated retreat. The path constricted sharply, high walls of stone and ice rising on either side. Perfect for an ambush. I signaled 2 units to flank the outer ridges while the rest followed me directly. Halfway through, the attack came. Arrows rained from above, glinting in cold light. My warriors raised shields in practiced unison. Steel rang. Snow erupted where shafts struck. Forward, I roared. We surged through the barrage, scaling the icy incline with ruthless efficiency. Rebels emerged from hidden ledges, blades flashing. The clash was immediate and brutal, steel against steel, breath against frost. I cut through the first opponent without slowing, pivoting into the next. My movements were precise, economical. No wasted motion. No hesitation. This was what I had been forged for. Through the chaos I searched for her. And then I saw her again, at the far end of the pass, dispatching one of my lieutenants with fluid, devastating grace. She fought like a storm-given flesh. Even at a distance I could sense her command. The rebels moved around her like extensions of her will. Our eyes met across the battlefield. A flicker. Recognition? Challenge? She turned and ran. I broke from the fray without thinking, pursuing her beyond the clash of armies, beyond the shouts and clash of steel. Upward. Always upward. The pass opened onto a narrow ridge leading toward the highest cliffs of the frost peaks. Wind tore at us mercilessly. Snow whipped sideways. The world narrowed to pursuit. You cannot outrun me, I called over the gale. She did not answer. But she did not stumble either. Blood marked her path again, brighter now. She was weakening. Good. Better to end it swiftly. My vow echoed in my mind with every pounding step. The rebel dies by my hand. Not for vengeance. For order. For unity. For survival. Ahead, the ridge ended in a jagged cliff overlooking a deadly plunge into mist and rock below. She slowed. Turned. Waited. The hunt was over. And though I did not yet know how profoundly my world was about to fracture, I felt the tremor of it beneath my skin as I approached the woman who had dared to challenge a king. Chapter 2. The ridge narrowed until there was nowhere left to go but forward, or down. Wind shrieked across the cliffside, tearing snow from the mountains and hurling it into the abyss below. The frost peaks rose like jagged teeth around us, ancient and merciless. Behind me, the clash of steel and dying cries faded into the distance as the final echoes of battle were swallowed by the storm. Ahead of me she stood alone, the midnight rebel. Moonlight bathed her in cold silver, illuminating the dark velvet that clung to her frame, embroidered with symbols older than my reign. They shimmered faintly beneath frost, ancient glyphs of protection and rebellion intertwined. Her silver hair whipped violently in the gale, strands catching light like spun starlight. Blood darkened one side of her waist, staining the deep midnight fabric. She did not look defeated. She looked unbreakable. Behind her, the cliff fell away into endless blackness. One misstep would mean death long before the body struck stone. I slowed my approach. She did not retreat. "You've run out of mountain," I said, my voice steady despite the storm. A faint, humorless smile touched her lips. "I was never running." The wind shifted between us, carrying the scent of iron and snow. "You slaughtered my patrols," I continued. "Destroyed supply lines. Incited rebellion in my territories." "I disrupted corruption," she corrected sharply. "And freed prisoners condemned without trial. You presume to lecture me on justice?" "I presume nothing," she replied. I witnessed. Her eyes, storm gray sharp as winter lightning, locked onto mine with a force that unsettled something deep in my chest. I stepped closer. "Remove the mask," I commanded. No. The refusal was immediate. Unyielding. "Very well." I drew my blade. Steel sang against the wind. She moved the instant I did. Her sword flashed from beneath her cloak in a blur of silver. She lunged, not wildly, not desperately, but with terrifying precision. I barely twisted in time, our blades colliding with a crack that echoed off the cliffs. The impact reverberated through my arm. She was strong. Stronger than most of my captains. We circled, boots grinding against ice. Snow spiraled violently between us, stinging skin, blinding vision. She struck low, I parried. I countered, she pivoted. Every movement she made was disciplined, trained. This was no village radical who had stumbled into revolution. She had been forged for combat. Our blades locked, hilts grinding together as we strained chest to chest. I could feel the heat of her breath through the frozen air. "You fight well," I muttered. "So do you." Her knee drove upward suddenly. I twisted, but not fast enough to avoid the jolt. She broke free, slashing across my shoulder. Leather split. Pain flared hot beneath the cold. My wolf stirred. Enough. I advanced with deliberate force, driving her back step by step. She gave ground reluctantly, deflecting blow after blow, boots slipping dangerously close to the cliff's edge. The wind howled louder, as if sensing the crescendo. She leapt to the side, attempting to circle, but I anticipated the shift. Our swords clashed again, once, twice. Then I shifted grip and struck her wrist with the flat of my blade. Her fingers spasmed. Her sword flew from her grasp and spun into the abyss. For one suspended second, we both watched it vanish into darkness. When her gaze returned to mine, there was no fear in it. Only fire. I closed the distance and seized her by the forearm, spinning her hard against the jagged stone face. My blade pressed to her throat, just enough to draw a thin line of red against pale skin. Her pulse beat against steel. Fast. Alive. The storm raged around us, yet inside that small space between our bodies, something else simmered. "End it," she said quietly. I studied the mask obscuring her face, black and steel shaped to conceal everything but those unyielding eyes. "Who are you?" I demanded. "The consequence of your silence." My jaw tightened. With my free hand I gripped the edge of her mask. For a heartbeat neither of us moved. Then I tore it away. The world stopped. Her face was not what I expected. Not hardened beyond recognition. Not twisted by fanaticism. She was breathtaking. Silver hair spilled freely around her shoulders, luminous in the moonlight. Frost clung to dark lashes, framing eyes that seemed to hold entire winter storms within them. A faint cut marked her temple, trailing down elegant cheekbones dusted in snow. And there, just below her collarbone where her torn velvet shifted, An intricate crescent sigil shimmered faintly. Ancient. Sacred. My breath caught. I knew that marking. Every alpha memorized the old text. The sign of the lunar bond. A myth to some. A legend whispered by elders. My grip faltered for half a second. She felt it. You hesitate, she murmured. The wind roared back to life, but something had changed. Not in the mountains. In me. Her scent reached me then, not fully, not consciously, but enough to stir something primal beneath my ribs. Cold air filled my lungs, yet heat spread beneath my skin. Focus. She was still a traitor. Still responsible for the blood staining the snow behind us. I pressed the blade firmer against her throat. On your knees, I ordered. Her chin lifted instead. Strike then. Defiance radiated from her like heat from flame. She would not beg. The royal guard emerged onto the ridge behind me, weapons drawn, breathing hard from the ascent. They froze at the sight before them. Their alpha with the rebel pinned against stone. Victory. Justice. This was how it was meant to end. Yet my heart pounded harder than it had during battle. Her eyes searched mine, not pleading, not apologizing. Challenging. You think killing me will end this? She asked softly. It will restore order. Order built on silence cracks eventually. Enough. My voice thundered across the cliffside. But even as I spoke, I felt it, something rising beneath the surface of instinct and fury. A recognition not born of logic. The moon shifted overhead, breaking through storm clouds. Light poured down upon us. It illuminated her skin, and the crescent mark glowed brighter. My chest burned suddenly. A searing pulse beneath armor, beneath flesh. I sucked in a sharp breath. What? Her eyes widened, not in fear but in shock. She felt it too. The wind slowed. The storm quieted. And somewhere deep within my bones, something ancient stirred awake. But that realization belonged to the next heartbeat. For now there was only this. My blade at her throat. Her breath against my skin. The abyss yawning behind her. And the undeniable sense that executing her would not end the rebellion. It would end me. The men behind me shifted uneasily. My king, one called. The word snapped like a whip. King. Alpha. Lawgiver. Executioner. I tightened my grip, fighting the tremor threatening my control. You have one chance, I said quietly so only she could hear. Surrender fully. Call off what remains of your insurgents. Her lips curved faintly, almost sadly. You still don't understand. Then make me. The wind caught her hair, lifting it like a banner of silver flame. I never wanted your throne, she said. I wanted your attention. Rage flared hot and immediate. You've had it. No, she whispered. Not like this. Something in her tone, raw, honest, dangerous, struck deeper than any blade. I searched her face for deception. Found none. Only conviction. Only truth. And something else beneath it. Recognition. The crescent mark pulsed again. My chest answered. The blade trembled. The royal guard watched in mounting confusion as seconds stretched thin. End it, my king, someone urged. End it? Yes. I was Orion Veilblood. I did not falter. I did not yield to sentiment. I upheld law, even when it demanded blood. I inhaled sharply, and lowered the sword. Not in surrender, not in mercy, but because something far older than law had just awakened between us. And killing her would mean severing a thread woven into my very soul. The storm returned in full force as if angered by my hesitation. Bind her, I commanded, forcing steel back into my voice. The guard obeyed at once, though their confusion lingered heavy in the air. As they secured her wrists, our eyes never left each other. This was not finished. This was not victory. This was the beginning of something far more dangerous than rebellion. Because war between enemies is simple. War between destiny and duty, that is devastation. Chapter 3. The moment the blade lowered, the world did not return to normal. It sharpened. The wind carved across the cliffside, yet I felt heat beneath my skin, searing, spreading, alive. The royal guard moved incautiously, binding her wrists with iron forged to weaken wolf strength. She did not resist. Her eyes never left mine. The moon broke fully from the clouds. And that was when it struck. Not subtly. Not gently. Silver birch and frost fire. The scent slammed into me like a physical force, driving the air from my lungs. It was not merely fragrance, it was recognition. Ancient. Primal. Absolute. My wolf surged forward violently, claws raking against bone and restraint. What? The word thundered through every vein. I staggered half a step back, breath hitching. Beneath my armor something burned. I tore open the clasp at my throat without thinking, fingers dragging across the leather and steel until cold air hit exposed skin. There, over my heart, a crescent mark flared into existence, glowing faintly silver beneath the moonlight. Gasps rippled behind me. The guards saw it. They saw everything. Her own mark answered the call. Through torn velvet, just below her collarbone, the crescent shimmered brighter, pulsing in perfect rhythm with mine. The mating bond. A legend spoken of in hushed reverence. Rare. Sacred. Unbreakable. Impossible. Not with her. Not with the midnight rebel. She inhaled sharply as though struck by the same invisible force. Her posture stiffened, and for the first time since I had cornered her, uncertainty flickered across her face. You feel it, I said, though my voice was rougher than I intended. Her jaw tightened. I feel something. The wind howled louder as if protesting fate itself. The guard shifted uneasily. I heard whispers, confusion, disbelief. My king, one murmured. I ignored them. The scent intensified, wrapping around me, burrowing into marrow. It carried memory I did not possess and promise I had never sought. My wolf pressed forward relentlessly, demanding proximity. Protection. Claiming. I stepped closer before I realized I was moving. The iron chains between her wrists clinked softly. You will not touch me, she said, but her voice lacked the same sharp edge as before. I stopped within arm's reach. The bond pulsed again. A thread, thin but unbreakable, seemed to stretch between us, tethering heartbeat to heartbeat. This changes nothing, I forced out. Her laugh was soft and bitter. It changes everything. She was right. The law was clear. Traitors die. The bond was sacred. Mates are eternal. Both truths stood before me like opposing armies. I turned abruptly to the guard. Return to the fortress. My king? One asked carefully. What of? I gave an order. No one challenged me further. We began the descent from the cliff, snow crunching beneath boots, wind snapping at cloaks. She walked beside me, bound but upright, refusing assistance even when the terrain grew treacherous. Every step closer to the stronghold intensified the pull between us. It was maddening. I could feel her emotions like faint echoes. Anger, defiance, something deeper buried beneath layers of discipline. And beneath it all, a flicker of something that mirrored my own confusion. You believe this is destiny? She asked quietly as we navigated a narrow pass. I believe in strength, I replied. That wasn't an answer. The bond thrummed again. I believe, I said slowly, that the moon goddess does not make mistakes. Her gaze flicked toward me. And yet you look as though you wish she had. I did not deny it. By the time the fortress walls came into view, night had fully claimed the mountains. Torches burned along the battlements, casting gold against endless white. Word traveled faster than wolves. By the time we entered the main gates, the courtyard had filled. Warriors, elders, citizens. Their eyes moved from her chains, to her face, to the mark glowing faintly at her collarbone, and finally to mine. Shock rippled outward like a stone thrown into still water. The bond? Someone whispered. It cannot be. She's the rebel. She's his mate. The murmurs grew louder. I raised a hand. Silence fell instantly. She will be confined, I announced, voice carrying across stone and snow. Until judgment is rendered. Judgment. The word felt fragile now. She lifted her chin as we passed through the crowd, unbowed by their stares. Some glared at her with hatred. Others with wary curiosity. A few with hope. That unsettled me more than anything. When we reached the entrance to the Moonstone Tower, she finally spoke again. You could end this, she said softly. How? Kill me before the bond fully takes root. The suggestion sliced deeper than any accusation. My wolf snarled in violent rejection. Do not speak of your death so easily, I growled. Why? She challenged. You were ready moments ago. That was before. Before the scent. Before the fire in my chest that refused to extinguish. Before the realization that harming her would mean carving out part of myself. The tower doors groaned open. As the guards led her inside, she paused, turning back toward me. For the first time, her expression shifted, not to fear but to something dangerously vulnerable. What is your name? She asked. The question startled me. Orion Veilblood. I know your title, she said quietly. I asked for your name. The bond pulsed softly between us. Orion, I repeated. She held my gaze for a long moment. Seraphina, she said. The name settled into me like a key sliding into its rightful lock. Seraphina. Not rebel. Not traitor. Seraphina. The doors closed between us with a heavy finality. But the bond did not diminish. If anything, it grew stronger. I stood there long after the courtyard emptied, long after torches dimmed and the moon climbed higher. Inside my chest, the crescent mark burned steady and bright. The pack had witnessed my hesitation. They had seen the mark. They would question. They would doubt. And the elders would demand blood. I had hunted the midnight rebel to preserve order. Instead, I had uncovered destiny. And destiny did not bow easily to law. As the wind swept through the fortress corridors, carrying with it the faintest trace of silver birch and frost fire, I understood one terrible truth. This was no longer a hunt. This was war between what I had sworn to uphold, and what my soul had already chosen. Chapter 4. Sleep did not come. I stood at the narrow window of my war chamber long after the fortress fell silent, watching snow drift in slow, indifferent spirals across the courtyard below. Torches guttered in the wind. Guards moved along the battlements in their practiced rotations, breath clouding in the cold. Everything looked exactly as it always had, stone and steel, discipline and order, the machinery of power running without pause or sentiment. And yet nothing was the same. The crescent mark over my heart had not faded. I pressed 2 fingers against it through the linen of my undershirt, feeling the low, persistent warmth that had not left since the cliff. It was not painful. That was perhaps the worst part. It felt like something long absent finally returned, a hearth rekindled in a room I had kept deliberately cold. I turned from the window and crossed to the table where maps lay spread beneath iron weights, the familiar topography of the frost peaks rendered in careful lines and shading. Supply routes. Patrol paths. The positions of outer settlements. I had spent years building this into the unassailable system it was, accounting for every variable, closing every gap. I had not accounted for this. The law was not complicated. It never had been. Traitors, saboteurs, those who raised arms against the Alpha's rule and incited rebellion within pack borders, they died. It was not cruelty. It was architecture. Remove one load-bearing stone and the wall collapses. Allow one act of defiance to go unpunished and you teach every wolf beneath you that defiance has a price ceiling. That there exists a threshold of audacity beyond which you will hesitate. Hesitation is how packs die. My father had taught me that before he taught me my letters. He had pressed the lesson into me with the particular thoroughness of a man who had watched weakness unravel everything his own father built. I had watched too. I had internalized it so deeply that it had become less philosophy and more anatomy, part of how I functioned, how I breathed. And now the law and the bond stood on opposite sides of a chasm, staring at one another, and I was the bridge between them with cracks spreading through my foundation. The mating bond was not a newer invention than the law. If anything, it was older. The elders spoke of it in reverent tones in the same breath they used for the moon goddess herself, described it as the divine fingerprint pressed into 2 souls before birth, the cosmic declaration that these 2 and no others were forged for one another. It was considered the highest sacred act of fate. To sever a mating bond was considered an abomination older texts did not even name directly, as though the act was too grave to commit to language. 2 absolutes. One body trying to hold both. I pressed my palms flat against the table and let my head drop forward, jaw tight, breath controlled. In the morning the elders would come. I already knew it. Counselor Aldrich, who had served 3 generations of Vale Bloods and whose loyalty was surpassed only by his rigidity. Elder Marin, whose knowledge of pack law was encyclopedic and merciless. The others, they would stand in this chamber with their measured expressions and their careful words, and they would remind me what I owed to the throne, to the pack, to the vow I had sworn under the full moon before every living member of this realm. The rebel dies by your hand. Your hand. Not a soldier's. Not an executioner's. What? I had said it that way deliberately, wanting the pack to understand the weight of my resolve. I had meant it. I had meant every word. Serafina. Her name moved through me like water through stone, slowly, persistently, finding every crack. I straightened and rolled the maps without looking at them, then walked to the door and opened it before I had consciously decided to move. The Moonstone Tower was set apart from the main fortress by a narrow covered walkway, its pale stone glowing faintly in the pre-dawn dark as though lit from within. 2 guards stood at the base and both straightened sharply at my approach, fists pressed to breastplates. I did not explain myself. Alpha Kings do not explain. They stepped aside. The staircase wound upward in tight spirals, each step worn smooth by centuries of use. The tower had held prisoners before, not often, but when the matter was significant enough to demand more than a common cell. It was not comfortable, but it was not cruel either. Stone walls, a narrow cot, a window too small to escape through but large enough to admit light and air. She was not sleeping. She sat on the floor with her back against the wall beneath the window, knees drawn loosely to one side, looking at nothing. Her silver hair fell unbound around her shoulders. Someone had given her a clean shirt to replace the torn velvet, rough-spun wool, nothing more, and she wore it with the same unself-conscious composure she had worn her battle garments. The iron manacles were gone. I had quietly ordered that. Iron forged to suppress wolf strength caused prolonged discomfort, and whatever she was to be charged with, unnecessary suffering, served no purpose. She heard me enter. Her gaze shifted without urgency, settling on me with that particular quality of assessment I was already learning to recognize, not hostility exactly, though the edge of it was present. Something more calculating. As though she were always measuring the distance between what was said and what was true. The king visits his prisoner before dawn, she said. Her voice was even, unhurried. That is either a good sign or a very bad one. I crossed to the opposite wall and stood there, arms folded. The space between us was perhaps 8 feet. The bond made it feel like inches. I want to understand, I said. Something shifted in her expression. It was subtle, a fractional softening, quickly contained. Understand what? Why? I held her gaze. Not the version the scouts whispered. Not the mythology the outer villages have built around you. I want to hear it from you in your own words without the mask. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, wind pressed against the tower in low, mournful gusts. You'll use it against me, she said at last. I'll use everything I learn, I replied honestly. But I'll know what I'm using. And so will you. Another silence. Then something resigned and resolute moved across her face, and she shifted, drawing her knees up, resting her forearms across them. I spent 4 years in your royal guard, she said. I did not react. The scout had told me as much. But hearing it from her mouth gave it different weight. 3rd Division. Eastern Border Patrol, primarily, with rotations through the interior supply corridors. Her voice was careful, precise, the cadence of someone who had trained herself to report facts before feelings. I was good at it. I believed in it. I believed in the structure, the discipline, the idea that a strong pack was a protected pack. And then, I said. Her eyes met mine. The storm gray was quieter than it had been on the cliff, but no less resolute. And then I watched a child die. The words landed softly. That was almost worse than if she had thrown them. Tell me. She exhaled slowly. Outer settlement. Reach of the Thornwood, eastern edge of your territory, 5 days hard ride from this fortress. A family of 6. The father had been a border scout, killed in a skirmish the winter before. No death compensation. Standard procedure in cases where the deceased had outstanding tithe debt. Her jaw tightened slightly. The harvest that year failed early. The food tithe was calculated before the failure was reported to the council. By the time the shortfall was documented, the collection had already been dispatched. I said nothing. The collectors came, she continued. I was part of the escort. We took what was owed under the formula. Legal, precise, documented. Pause. The youngest child was 4. By the time a supplement order could theoretically have been processed through the proper channels and reached that settlement, if anyone had prioritized it, which they would not have, she was already dead. The tithe formula accounts for minimum sustenance. The formula was written 30 years ago, she said, and for the first time there was heat in her voice, controlled but unmistakable. When the outer territories had twice the population and functioning trade networks, the margins it was built on no longer exist. The council knows this. It has been brought before them. I brought it before them. 3 times through proper channels with written accounts and settlement records. Her eyes held mine unflinchingly. 3 times it was tabled for further study. The silence that followed was heavier than the one before it. You could have continued bringing the issue forward, I said. I heard the inadequacy of it even as I spoke. A 4th report, she said quietly. A 5th attempt. While children in the Thornwood and the Pale Ridges and the Ashfin settlements went without. She shook her head. I watched your system work perfectly, Orion. Every wheel turning exactly as designed. And a child starved on the outer edge of your kingdom because the machine was too slow and the council too comfortable to look up from their ledgers. The name struck differently than the title. She had used it deliberately, the same way she had asked for it in the tower doorway, as though insisting on the person behind the crown. The supply route disruptions, I said. The storehouses. Council storehouses, she clarified. Not civilian supply lines. I was careful about that. What we took was redistributed, directly, without bureaucratic filtering, to the settlements most critically short. We kept records. A faint, wry note entered her voice. Detailed ones. I imagine your investigators have found them by now. I had not yet read the full intelligence reports from the camps we had seized. I had been somewhat preoccupied. And the warriors you killed? She met this without flinching. Those who came to stop the distributions by force. I did not seek those deaths. I tried to avoid them when I could. When I could not, she paused. I made choices I will carry. I won't pretend otherwise. She looked at me steadily and I saw it then, not the absence of guilt, but the shape of a person who had made a terrible accounting and decided the ledger still balanced. Who had weighed the certain suffering of the many against the potential blood of a confrontation and had chosen to act, knowing full well what it would cost. It was not so different from decisions I had made. That realization moved through me like ice water, clarifying and uncomfortable in equal measure. You were trained to follow orders, I said. To trust the chain of command. To believe the system would self-correct. I did believe it, she said. Genuinely. And then I had to decide whether my belief in the system was worth more than the people the system was failing. She paused. I decided it was not. You could have come to me directly. Something crossed her face, not quite a smile, not quite grief. Could I? She asked softly. The Alpha King who had publicly vowed to execute the Midnight Rebel? Who had made the suppression of my movement a matter of personal honor before the full moon assembly. She tilted her head slightly. You are not a man who leaves doors open for those he has named as enemies. I know because I trained under men who served you and I saw how you operate. Once the vow was made, any direct approach would have ended with my head on a pike and the problem buried beneath the story of my defeat. I wanted to dispute it. I could not. You fought to be heard, I said. I fought, she said carefully, because I tried everything else first. And because someone had to. She unfolded her arms, pressing one hand lightly against the cold stone floor. I never wanted your throne. I never wanted your death. I never wanted any of this to be war. The quietness in her voice was absolute. I wanted you to see what I had seen. I wanted the machine to have a conscience. I wanted the strongest man in the Frostpeak realm to turn that strength toward the people who needed it instead of only toward the people who threatened him. She sought to change him. The scouts whispered words. now wearing flesh and context, and the gray-eyed gaze of a woman sitting on a stone floor in a borrowed wool shirt, unbreakable even here. The bond pulsed between us, low and steady like a second heartbeat. I did not move. I was afraid that if I moved, the fragile and precarious thing happening in this room would fracture, and I would lose the thread of it. The thread back to something true. The elders will come at dawn, I said. I know. They will demand a verdict. I know that too. I studied her face, the clean lines of it, the shadows under her eyes that spoke of exhaustion she would not surrender to, the faint bruising along her jaw from the fight on the cliff. The crescent mark at her collarbone caught the faint light through the window, shimmering softly. Why the mask? I asked, though it was perhaps not the most pressing question. It was the one that had found me in odd moments since I had torn it away. She considered. Partly tactical, anonymity protected my followers as much as myself. Partly symbolic. Pause. The Midnight Rebel was an idea more than a person. Ideas are harder to kill than people. And I needed the idea to outlast me if it came to that. She had planned for her own death and built her cause to survive it. I exhaled slowly. If you had known, she asked, and her voice was quieter now, careful with the question as though she understood its weight. If you had truly known what was happening in the outer settlements, the children, the debt collection formulas, the council's deliberate inertia, would you have acted? The answer rose immediately, instinctively. Yes. She nodded once, slowly. I believe you, she said. That is the tragedy of it. Not that you are a cruel king, but that the crown creates a kind of distance, a vast, quiet distance between the man wearing it and the ground he rules. And the men closest to you have interest in what you see and do not see. It landed like a blow delivered without malice, purely by virtue of being true. I had prided myself on knowing my realm. I had ridden out personally, led campaigns personally, refused to govern from behind walls of intermediaries. I had believed that made me different, better, more connected to the reality of my people. But she had walked those outer roads. She had stood in those settlements. She had seen what my system produced at its furthest edges, where the scrutiny of power grew thin and the consequences of policy landed on those least equipped to absorb them. And she had come back transformed by it. I had remained in my certainty. Something shifted in my chest, not the bond this time, but something older than that. Something adjacent to shame that I recognized with difficulty because I so rarely encountered it in relation to my own conduct. The law demands your execution, I said, not as a threat, as a statement of the problem we were both sitting inside. I know. The bond? I stopped. She looked at me, waiting. The bond makes that impossible, I finished. She was quiet for a moment. Are you telling me or yourself? Well, neither. I did not answer. I pushed off the wall and moved to the door, pausing with my hand against the frame. The warmth at my chest pulsed once, gently, in the direction of the woman behind me. The elders, I said, will expect a decision. Then you should rest, she replied. You'll need your mind clear. I turned back, and for a moment we simply regarded each other across the narrow stone room. Two people standing at the collision point of law and destiny, neither willing to look away from the damage the impact had already done. Serafina. Her name. Not her title. Not her designation. She met my gaze. I am going to look at the settlement records myself, I said quietly. All of them. Tonight. Something crossed her face, swift and unguarded, gone before it could fully form. But I caught it. Relief. Raw, startled relief. As though she had been carrying the weight of being believed for so long that the moment it finally arrived, her body did not quite know what to do with it. She said nothing. I turned and descended the stairs into the dark. Behind me, I felt the bond stretch taut and luminous between us, a thread of silver fire reaching from her chest to mine across stone and distance and every law I had ever sworn to uphold. The elders would come at dawn. The pack would demand resolution. And I would stand before all of it, having spent the remaining hours of night reading reports I should have read long ago, seeing my kingdom through the eyes of the woman I was supposed to have killed, and feeling, with the slow, irreversible certainty of stone giving way to water, that the king I had been until tonight was not the king the Frost Peak realm actually needed, that the man who could become that king was still being forged, and that fate, in its infinite and maddening design, had sent the only person capable of finishing that work, bound to my soul, standing against my law, unyielding in a moonstone tower while I descended into the dark and began at last to see. Chapter 5. 3 days passed before the elders formally convened. In those 3 days I did not sleep. Not properly. I moved through the fortress with the same controlled efficiency I always projected, attending councils, reviewing border reports, receiving delegation from 2 outer pack alliances who had arrived with winter tribute and cautious eyes. I performed the role with the precision of long practice, saying exactly what was required, conceding nothing, betraying nothing. And every night, after the fortress settled into silence and the last torch in the main corridor guttered low, I climbed the Moonstone Tower stairs. I told myself the first visit had been necessary intelligence gathering. The second, a continuation of that assessment. By the third, I had run out of justifications that satisfied even my own rigorous internal standard, and I stopped attempting them. The bond drew me. That was the simple truth I was not yet willing to speak aloud. She was always awake when I arrived. I did not know whether she slept during the hours I was absent and simply came alert at the sound of my boots on the stair, or whether sleep was as elusive for her as it had become for me. I never asked. Asking would have required acknowledging that I wondered. On the 4th night I brought documents. A leather satchel of them. The settlement records I had spent the first sleepless night retrieving from the administrative archive myself, before any clerk could note the request. Reports spanning 6 years. Supply allocation records. Tithe collection logs. Mortality registers from the outer territories that had been filed, stamped, and apparently shelved without ever surfacing in a council briefing. I dropped them onto the floor between us without ceremony and sat down with my back against the opposite wall, mirroring the position she always occupied, the cold of the stone seeping through my clothing. She looked at the satchel. Then at me. "You read them," she said. Not a question. Every page. Something moved through her expression. She reached forward and drew the satchel toward her, loosening the ties, spreading the documents across the floor with a familiarity that told me she had seen most of them before, had perhaps compiled some of them herself. "The Ashvin mortality figures," I said. "The winter before last. 14 deaths attributable to cold and malnutrition in the northern quarter alone." Her voice was even, but the evenness had weight to it. The weight of having carried the numbers for a long time. The council received the initial report in early autumn, before the worst of it. They had time. "They tabled it," I said. "They tabled it." I had spent most of the previous night constructing the most charitable possible interpretation of the council's inaction. Supply chain disruption, competing resource demands, the genuine administrative complexity of governing a realm this size through a brutal winter. I had built a careful, reasonable defense of the men I had trusted. It had not held. The documents were too precise and the pattern too consistent. Year after year, the outer settlements appeared in reports as footnotes, numbers rather than names, logistics rather than lives. The council had not acted through malice, perhaps. But there was a particular kind of negligence that comfort produces, a soft and self-perpetuating blindness that grows in men who are never hungry, never cold, never required to reckon with the distance between policy and consequence. I had governed through those men. I had not looked past them. "You're angry," Serafina said. She was watching me with that measuring quality again, reading something in my stillness that I had not consciously projected. "Yes," I said. "At the council. Among others." She was quiet for a moment. "If you're about to include yourself in that accounting, I won't stop you." There was no satisfaction in her voice. That was what unsettled me. No relish in the observation, no performance of vindication. Just a woman reading the room with unflinching accuracy. "I should have seen it," I said. "You were shown a version of it they controlled." She drew her knees up, resting her chin briefly on one arm before she straightened. "That's not absolution. But it's context. I do not need absolution from you." "No," she agreed evenly. "You need it from yourself. That'll take longer." Irritation flared hot and immediate. I held it. There was something infuriating about the particular way she delivered truth, not as an attack but as a simple observation, with the calm of someone who has made peace with the discomfort of honesty. It left me no clean surface to push back against. You are extraordinarily composed, I said, for a prisoner awaiting judgment. I've been awaiting judgment for 2 years, she replied. Since the moment I made the first decision. I had time to prepare. You expected to be caught. I expected to be killed, she corrected without inflection. Being caught is the more complicated outcome. I studied her in the thin moonlight filtering through the tower window. It caught her hair, turned it luminous, made the crescent mark at her collarbone glow with that faint, persistent shimmer I had come to look for involuntarily. The bond stirred as it always did in her proximity. Low and constant, like an ember that refused to cool. You're staring, she said. I'm thinking. At my collarbone. Heat moved across the back of my neck. I shifted my gaze deliberately to the documents between us. Tell me about the Pale Ridge distributions. The records show 6 events in 4 months, but the council seizure logs only account for 3 of your campsites in that region. You had infrastructure they didn't find. She held my gaze for a beat, a flicker of something sharp and almost amused, before she let it pass, reaching for the relevant document. We worked through the records for more than an hour. That was how our evenings had begun to structure themselves. Conflict that found its way by some unplanned route into conversation that was almost collaborative. She answered questions with more transparency than I had any right to expect, and I asked them with more genuine curiosity than either of us had initially anticipated. It did not make her less of a prisoner. It did not make me less of her captor. But it created something in the space between those two facts that I had not yet found language for. On the 5th night, I arrived to find her standing at the narrow window, hands braced on the stone ledge, looking out at the mountains. The moon was high and full, flooding the frost peaks in blue-white brilliance, the snow catching and holding the light until the entire landscape glowed. She did not turn at my entrance. It's beautiful, she said. I forgot how it looks from elevation. My patrol posts in the 3rd Division were mostly valley routes. I came to stand a few feet behind her. The window was too small for 2 people to look through simultaneously, but the angle was such that I could see the same span of mountain she was watching. A long, serrated ridgeline trailing into darkness, the highest peaks catching cloud that moved in slow silver banks beneath the stars. You miss it, I said. The guard. Pause. I missed the version of it I believed in. She turned then, and the proximity was suddenly different. The window ledge at her back, the narrow tower room, the moonlight between us. 8 feet of cold stone floor that the bond was doing its quiet, relentless work to make feel like nothing at all. Why do you keep coming here? She asked. Directness for directness. It was the operating principle our conversations had developed, though neither of us had stated it. The bond? I said. The bond pulls, she said. That's not a reason, that's a mechanism. I looked at her. I want to understand you. Fully. Before, I stopped. Before you decide what to do with me, she finished. Before I decide what I believe. She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. And what you believe will determine what you do. It always has. She folded her arms, a gesture that might have been warmth-seeking and might have been self-containment. The wool shirt was inadequate for the tower's cold, and I had arranged for warmer clothing to be sent, which she wore now, heavier fabric lined. She had not thanked me for it. She had also not refused it. The elders convene in 2 days, she said. Yes. Counselor Aldrich will push for immediate execution. He'll argue that every day of delay erodes your authority. He will. He's not entirely wrong, she said, and the bluntness of it startled a sound from me, half laugh, half exhale, that surprised us both. You argue for your own execution with impressive consistency, I said. I argue for clarity, she replied, and there was the faintest edge of something in her voice, something I might have mistaken for humor if I had not been paying close attention. If you're going to defy the elders and the law and every precedent your reign has established, you should do it knowing exactly what the cost is. Not slide into it by increments in a moonlit tower. There it was. Said plainly without flinching, dropped between us like a stone into still water. I watched the ripples. You think I am sliding? I said. I think, she said carefully, that you came here every night this week, and that you told your guard rotation you were conducting interrogations, and that you brought documents to sit on a stone floor at midnight like a man who has questions he cannot ask anyone else. She held my gaze. I think that is not the behavior of a king who has made up his mind. The anger came back, sharper this time because it was not truly directed at her. She had simply named the thing I had been moving around for 5 days, and my instinct was to punish the naming. I pushed off the wall and crossed toward her before I had a clear intention, stopping a stride away. This close, her scent was unavoidable, silver birch and frost fire, the same recognition that had driven the air from my lungs on the cliff, quieter now but no less absolute. The crescent mark burned. Her chin lifted. She did not step back. "You came here every night this week," I said. "You could have refused the visits. You could have been silent. You could have used them to argue for your freedom or attempt to negotiate terms." I searched her face. "You did none of those things. You talked to me. You showed me the records. You told me the truth without leverage." "I always intended to tell the truth," she said. "I just never expected the opportunity. Why give it freely? What do you want?" "I told you," she said. "I want you to see. I have seen." "You've read documents," she said, with a quiet ferocity that cut through my certainty. "That is not the same as seeing. You've processed data from a tower room at midnight and you felt the appropriate outrage and you've recalibrated your understanding of your council's failures." She paused. "But you haven't stood in those settlements. You haven't looked at the people your system treats as margins. You haven't let that be real to you yet. Not in your body, not in the way things become real when you cannot go back to a warm fortress and close the door." Her voice was controlled but the passion behind it was not. It pressed against the surface of her discipline like water against a dam, contained, purposeful, but vivid with the force of something that had been moving a long time. We were too close. I was aware of it with every part of my attention, including the parts one was attempting to direct elsewhere. The bond was not helping. It had developed, in 5 nights of proximity, from a steady ember into something more deliberately demanding. A warmth that suggested direction, that oriented me toward her with the patient insistence of a compass finding north. "If you keep looking at me like that," she said very quietly, "one of us will do something tactically inadvisable." I stepped back. The deliberateness of it was probably visible. I did not care. She exhaled, slow, controlled, and looked back toward the window. "The law demands a verdict," she said in the voice she used when she wanted the conversation on harder ground. "I know that. You know that. The question is whether you believe the law as written is still just, or whether you've been enforcing a structure that has calcified past its purpose. Pack law exists because—" "I know why it exists," she said. "I know every argument for it. I was trained on those arguments. I believe them." She turned back and there was grief in her face now, not self-pity, but the grief of someone who has lost a simpler version of their own convictions. Strong law protects the pack. Unity preserves the realm. Dissent unchecked becomes chaos. She recited them like something memorized young. I lived by those principles for 4 years. And then I watched them grind the outer settlements to dust in the name of stability, and I asked myself whether the stability being preserved was the pack's, or the council's. It was the most precisely stated thing she had yet said, and it moved through me with the specific discomfort of a question I had been half-forming in the dark for days without allowing it to complete itself. "Laws written in strength can become instruments of comfort," I said. It was not agreement exactly. It was the thought completing itself aloud. "Yes," she said simply. Silence gathered between us. Not hostile. Not easy either. I reached down and collected the documents from the floor, returning them to the satchel. Buying time. Buying distance from the territory the conversation had entered. "My father governed through absolute law," I said. "He believed any deviation was the beginning of dissolution. He was not wrong, not entirely. I have watched packs fragment over softer things than principle. And he was right about that," she said. "Principle matters. Structure matters. But there is a difference between a law that protects the wolf at the edge of the territory and a law that protects the man in the stone fortress who no longer has to look at the wolf at the edge of the territory." I stood with the satchel in one hand, looking at the woman who had been the most significant threat to my reign and who was, in this moment, the most honest voice I had heard in years. The realization settled like the first deep snow of winter, quiet, thorough, fundamentally altering the landscape it covered. "You were trained in the 3rd Division," I said. "Yes." "Sergeant or lieutenant?" A faint pause. "Lieutenant. By the end." I had wondered. The way she fought, the way she structured her campaign, the way she organized intelligence and managed her people. It bore the marks of real leadership training, not instinct alone. She had been good at this. Good enough that someone in my own ranks had helped shape her into exactly the kind of opponent she had become. "You would have been promoted," I said. She looked at me for a long moment. "Probably," she said quietly. The ghost of something passed between us, not quite sorrow but adjacent to it. The version of things in which this had gone differently, in which she had not had to make the choice she made. "I should go," I said. She nodded. Neither of us moved for a breath longer than was necessary. "Orion." Her voice stopped me at the door. I turned. She was watching me with an expression I had not seen from her before, stripped of the combat readiness she wore like second armor, quieter than she usually permitted herself to be in my presence. Vulnerable was not the right word. Visible, perhaps. "The laws you questioned tonight," she said. "Whatever you decide, decide it because you believe it. Not because of the bond. Not because of me." Pause. "You trusted your own judgment before you knew I existed. Trust it now." The mark over my heart pulsed. I held her gaze for a moment longer than I intended. Then I descended the stairs into the dark and stood at the base of the tower for a long time, listening to the wind scrape across the battlements, feeling the bond stretch taut and luminous above me, and understanding with the particular clarity of a man who can no longer pretend ambiguity serves him, that the laws I had climbed these stairs to enforce were no longer the same shape they had been when I descended them 5 nights ago. Something had cracked. Not in the law itself, in the certainty with which I had held it. And a king who cannot examine the foundations of what he builds is not a strong king. He is only a stubborn one. The elders would convene in 2 days. And for the first time in my reign, I did not already know what I would say. Chapter 6. I postponed the elder council. It was not a decision I made lightly. Counselor Aldrich sent 3 separate requests for confirmation of the convening date before I summoned him directly and told him, with the particular quality of stillness I had learned could communicate more finality than volume, that the matter required further examination before any verdict could be rendered in good conscience. He held my gaze for a moment too long, not quite insolence, not quite concern, then bowed and withdrew. I did not watch him go. I was already thinking about the documents. There is a particular kind of investigation that cannot be conducted through official channels, because the official channels are part of what you are investigating. I understood this instinctively, the way I understood combat strategy, by feel as much as reason, the body knowing the geometry of a situation before the mind has fully articulated it. Whatever had been happening in the outer settlements, whatever had been filed and buried and bureaucratically absorbed for years, had survived intact precisely because every mechanism that should have surfaced it had been managed by the same hands that allowed it to continue. I needed different hands. I had 3 men I trusted without qualification. Not because I had tested them recently, but because they had been tested by circumstance over years and had not failed the test. Davin, my second in command since the Northern Campaign, who had a gift for methodical patience that I had always recognized as a more useful quality than speed. Ruel, my intelligence captain, who was perhaps the only man in the fortress who could be genuinely unpleasant company and was that way because he had never learned to tell someone a comfortable half-truth when an uncomfortable whole one was available. And Sessa, who held no official rank that meant anything on paper but who had functioned as my informal archivist for 11 years and who possessed an almost supernatural ability to locate, within minutes, any document that had ever passed through fortress administration. I called them to my private war chamber before dawn on the 6th day of Seraphina's imprisonment, before the fortress had fully woken, before anyone could observe the meeting and begin constructing narratives about it. I told them what I needed. Not why, not in full. Davin did not ask. Ruel looked at me with the particular flat expression he wore when he had already suspected the answer and was withholding judgment. Sessa asked 2 clarifying questions, received 2 direct answers, and said she would begin immediately. By evening of the same day, she had produced a secondary archive. It filled a crate. I sent the others away and worked through the night. The first layer was almost manageable. Supply requisition logs that showed minor discrepancies. Allocations that had been recorded as dispatched to outer settlements but whose quantities, when cross-referenced against receipt confirmations, did not match. Small variances. The kind that could be clerical error, except that they ran consistently in one direction year after year, settlement after settlement. Shortfalls that arrived on one side of the ledger as waste or transit loss and vanished on the other as though they had never existed. The second layer was worse. Sessa had located a series of secondary accounting records, not the official ledgers but working documents, the kind generated during the actual process of administration before the final figures were sanitized for the official record. These had been stored in an unlabeled archive section that had apparently been treated as administrative overflow, too mundane to review and too voluminous to discard. Someone had relied on that assumption to hide things in plain sight. The numbers were not ambiguous. Over 7 years, tithe collection from outer territories had been calculated using population and harvest assessments that bore no meaningful relationship to the actual conditions on the ground. The assessors, all council appointed, all reporting to a single administrative chain that terminated at Councillor Aldrich's office, had consistently overstated harvest yields and understated settlement vulnerability. The result was a systematic over-extraction from the settlements least capable of absorbing it, producing a consistent surplus in the central storehouses that was then allocated to projects and expenditures that did not appear in any public record I had ever reviewed. I sat back. The cold in the room had nothing to do with the temperature. I thought about Serafina sitting on the floor of the Moonstone Tower with the quiet patience of someone who had been carrying knowledge like this for years, knowing exactly what it meant, knowing exactly what had been done to prevent it from reaching the man who could have acted on it. I thought about her filing reports, 3 of them documented, received, acknowledged, and watching them disappear into the same administrative apparatus that had generated the problem. I thought about a child in the Thornwood 4 years old. Rage came. I had expected it, had felt it building through the second layer of documents, and I did not fight it. There are moments when anger is not a failure of discipline but a correct response to a factual situation, and I had learned to distinguish between them. This was the second kind. This was the anger of a man confronting the gap between what his realm was supposed to be and what it had, in certain corridors of power, quietly become. But I did not act on it immediately because there is also a difference between righteous anger and useful anger, and I had learned that difference from my father by watching him fail to make it. I called Ruel back in the early morning hours. He entered, looked at the documents spread across the table, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he sat down without being asked and began reading. An hour later he looked up. "Aldrich," he said. "Aldrich," I confirmed. "And at least 2 of the assessment officers. Possibly the full chain." Pause. "This has been running since before your father's last years. The architecture of it predates your reign. That does not reduce my responsibility for it continuing." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't." He looked at me steadily. "The rebel was not wrong," I said. Ruel, who had built a career on the careful management of his own reactions, let a breath out slowly. "She brought this through official channels. 3 times. He looked back at the documents. "Aldrich received those reports." "Yes." "And buried them." "Yes." Another silence. Outside, the fortress had begun to wake. Distant sounds of the morning guard rotation, the clatter of the kitchens coming to life, the particular quality of noise that marked a living stronghold beginning its day. "What do you want me to do?" Ruel asked. I told him. He listened without interruption, nodded once when I finished, and left. I did not move for some time after. There are reckonings that arrive in pieces. A first wave that shocks, a second that clarifies, a third that requires you to reassemble your understanding of things you thought you knew. The first wave had been Serafina on the cliff. The second had been the documents. The third was sitting in this room at dawn, understanding not only that my council had failed my people, but that they had done so deliberately, systematically, within a structure I had built and maintained, beneath the authority of my name. Every execution order I had given. Every supply decision approved in council session. Every tithe formula ratified without my personal review of the underlying assessment methodology, because I had trusted the chain of men responsible for that review, because I had governed through them, because I had been, in this specific and consequential way, exactly the distant King Serafina had described. The throne creates distance. She had said it without accusation, almost gently, in the way you name a structural flaw rather than a moral one. And I had bristled at it because it was true. I had governed with discipline and strength and genuine commitment to the pack's survival. And I had also, through the confident machinery of my own certainty, made it easy for corrupt men to operate within my blind spots. Both of those things were true simultaneously. That was the hardest part, not the corruption itself, which had a clarity to it once exposed, a wrongness that demanded response and could be answered with action. The harder part was the self-examination that came after. The quiet accounting. The question of what kind of king allows this to happen and what kind of king it takes to make sure it does not happen again, and whether those are the same king or whether becoming the second requires genuinely ceasing to be the first. I left the war chamber without a cloak. The fortress corridors were cold in the early morning, stone walls radiating the accumulated chill of the night. I moved through them without speaking to anyone, which was not unusual. Orion Veilblood walking through his own fortress before full dawn was not a remarkable occurrence and generated no concern. It simply generated space, guards stepping back, servants pressing close to walls, the instinctive deference of people who have learned to read the atmosphere around power. I climbed the Moonstone Tower. She was awake. Of course she was. I had begun to wonder if she slept at all, or whether the tower's cold had simply stripped that from her too. One more ordinary thing surrendered at the edge of a cliff. She was sitting at the small table now, not the floor. Someone had brought her paper and ink at my order, not as luxury, simply because I had imagined spending weeks in a tower room with nothing to do and found the image intolerable. She had been writing. She turned the pages face down when she heard the door, a gesture that was automatic and then self-conscious, and she met my gaze with the particular wariness of someone trying to read a situation before committing to a posture. She read something in my face. I saw it happen, a shift in her stillness, a sharpening. "What happened?" she asked. I crossed the room and sat down on the floor. Not across from her. I had left that geometry behind somewhere in the middle of the night with the documents. I sat with my back against the wall near the table where she sat, close enough that the bond between us settled into a steadier warmth, close enough to talk without raising voices. She turned her chair to face me. She did not ask again. She waited. "The assessors falsified yield reports for 7 years," I said. "Systematically. Consistently. In a direction that served the council's surplus allocation and stripped the outer settlements of their actual margins." Pause. "The reports you filed were received by Aldrich. They were not tabled for further study. They were suppressed. Not a flinch. Not vindication." She closed her eyes for a moment, just a moment, and when she opened them they were very clear and very still. "I suspected Aldrich was involved," she said. "I didn't have proof. You have it now." "You have it," she corrected gently. "That's different. It matters, but it's different." She was right again. Proof in her hands had no legal standing. Proof in mine remade the question entirely. "The girl?" I said. "In the Thornwood." "Elia," she said. The name came immediately, without effort, as though it had lived at the surface of her for years. I looked at her. "She had a name," Serafina said quietly. 4 years old, and she had a name, and her mother called her Elia, and she liked to catch snowflakes on her tongue. She said it without performance, without anger, with the simple and devastating specificity of someone who had made a point of learning the names because the names were what the ledgers refused to include. I know 17 names from 7 years of settlement mortality records. 17 people who would be alive if the formula had been accurate and the council had acted on the reports. 17. Not a statistic. 17 times someone had called a name into a cold room and not been answered. Something moved through me that was not quite grief. I had not known these people, had not had the chance, but was adjacent to grief in the way that a sudden awareness of an absence you didn't know you carried creates something that feels like loss. The knowledge of what had been allowed, what had been quietly permitted on the outer edges of my realm while I sat at my war table reviewing border maps and supply chains. 17 names. I had been the alpha who was supposed to protect them. That was the fundamental premise of the role, the first obligation from which every other law descended. And I had spent 7 years enforcing the letter of a structure that had been quietly hollowed out beneath me, producing verdicts on those who disrupted it without ever asking what the disruption was actually about. I pressed 2 fingers over the crescent mark without thinking. It burned steadily. Serafina watched me do it. "Say what you're thinking," she said. "Not a demand. An offering." "I am thinking," I said slowly, "that I spent 3 weeks hunting you through blizzards in order to execute you for treason, and that the treason you committed was attempting to correct a failure I should have caught and corrected myself." I exhaled. "And that the law I intended to apply to you was enforced by the same apparatus that generated the conditions you were responding to." She was quiet. I owe you an accounting, I said. You don't owe me anything, she said. You owe it to Elia. And to the other 16. And to everyone in the outer settlements still living under a structure that hasn't changed yet. I looked at her directly. That is why you did not fight harder on the cliff. Why you let yourself be taken. She held my gaze. Dying on a cliffside doesn't fix anything. The only way this changes is if you change it. And the only way you change it is if you understand why it needs to change. Pause. I was betting that you were the kind of man who, if he saw the truth, would not look away from it. A significant bet, I said. I had some evidence for it, she said. You never govern through cruelty. Only through certainty. Certainty can be revised. Cruelty can't. The distinction mattered. I turned it over, examining it. Somewhere beneath my ribs, the last of the framework I had been standing on shifted definitively. Not collapsing, I was not built for collapse and neither was the situation. But restructuring. The load transferring to different supports, the architecture reorganizing itself around a new understanding of what the weight actually was and what it required. I moved from the wall. I did not think about it. I did not decide it in the calculating, deliberate way I made most decisions. The movement came from somewhere below strategy, from the place where the bond lived, yes, but also from something older than the bond, something that had to do with the specific gravity of being wrong in ways that cost other people everything. I sank to one knee on the stone floor in front of her chair. She went very still. I was Orion Veilblood, Alpha King. I did not kneel. Not in ceremony, not in defeat, not before elders or allies or the full moon assembly. There was not a living person in the Frost Peak realm who had seen me in this posture. I looked up at her. I failed the outer territories, I said. I failed the people my law was supposed to protect, and I did it through the comfortable mechanism of governing from a distance and trusting men I did not examine closely enough, because examination would have required me to question systems I had been taught were sound. I held her gaze. I failed you specifically. You tried to show me through the correct channels and the channels were compromised and I branded you an enemy for doing through force what I should have made possible through governance. Serafina looked at me for a long moment. Her expression was not what I expected. Not triumph. Not the releasing sigh of someone who had waited a long time to be told they were right. Something more complex than either, recognition, and beneath it, something tentative and careful and not yet ready to be named. Get up, she said quietly. Not yet. Orion. I am not kneeling as a king, I said. I am not performing penitence for the elders or the pack or the record. I am kneeling because it is the accurate physical representation of where I stand in relation to what I should have done, and I will not shortcut it because it is uncomfortable. I paused. It should be uncomfortable. She looked at me for a long time with those storm-gray eyes that saw too much and said too little and had been carrying this particular weight for years before I had arrived to share it. Then, very slowly, she reached out and rested her hand briefly on my shoulder. Not absolution. Not forgiveness. That was a longer process and she was not the only one to whom it was owed. Just acknowledgement. The quiet, weighty acknowledgement of one person to another that they have crossed a threshold that cannot be uncrossed. I rose. I stood in the narrow tower room in the growing morning light, the crescent mark burning over my heart, the bond between us steadier and more certain than it had ever been. Not because anything had been resolved, but because something had been at last made honest. What happens now? She asked. I looked toward the window where the frost peaks rose in cold and luminous indifference beyond the glass. The elders. The pack. The law that still sat unrevised between us and any version of this that was livable. Now, I said, I go to work. Chapter 7. It happened on the 7th night. I had spent the preceding days moving with deliberate and controlled efficiency through the wreckage that the documents had revealed. Ruel had begun the quiet process of building a secondary evidentiary record, one that could survive legal challenge and elder scrutiny. Davin had implemented a discreet internal security review, reassigning certain personnel without explanation, restructuring access to administrative archives. Sessa had located 3 additional years of working documents that further solidified the pattern. The machine of accountability had been set in motion, carefully, without announcement, in the particular way that effective action is conducted before the people it targets understand what is happening. Aldrich had noticed something. I saw it in his council attendance. A new quality of watchfulness, a fractional tightening around his composure that had not been present before. He was too experienced to show alarm and too intelligent not to feel it. I had not moved against him yet. Timing mattered. A charge brought before the evidence was airtight would give him room to reframe the narrative, and the narrative he would construct, the Alpha King protecting his traitorous mate by discrediting the council, was not entirely without potential purchase. I needed the record to be undeniable before I placed it before the pack's full scrutiny. In the meantime, I continued to delay the Elder Council, continued my nightly visits to the tower, continued the slow and difficult work of understanding, with precision, exactly what I intended to do about all of it. The assassination attempt did not announce itself. At the 3rd hour past midnight, a sound reached me through the half-sleep I had been maintaining, not the rhythmic movements of the guard rotation, which I knew by pattern as thoroughly as my own heartbeat, but something offset from that pattern, a gap where sound should have been. I was on my feet before full consciousness arrived, weapon in hand by reflex, moving toward the door of my chamber on instinct. The corridor was empty, but the bond was screaming. Not the low, steady warmth I had grown accustomed to, the persistent ember of proximity and recognition. Something else entirely. A violent, searing pull that drove the air from my lungs and turned my wolf from a controlled presence into something immediate and ferocious, claws raking from the inside, demanding forward motion. Serafina. I ran. The fortress corridors blurred. I took the covered walkway to the Moonstone Tower at a dead sprint, and I was halfway up the stairs when I heard it, the particular sound of steel on stone, of bodies in motion, of a struggle being conducted by people who did not want to be hurt. The tower door hung open. I came through it into chaos. 3 of them. Dark clothing, faces obscured, moving with the coordinated precision of trained fighters rather than opportunists. The tower room was small, deliberately so, which should have favored them. They had numbers and preparation and the element of what had been intended as surprise. What they had not accounted for was Serafina. She had the first one disarmed before I cleared the doorway. I did not know where she had found the iron candle holder she was using, the narrow, heavy kind mounted to the wall, but she wielded it with the adaptability of a fighter who had long ago made peace with using whatever came to hand. She drove him back with 2 strikes that would have fractured bone through armor and spun toward the second without pause. I took the third. He came at me with a short blade and the disciplined footwork of formal training. I deflected, closed the distance, and ended it with the economical efficiency of a man who had been killing in defense of his own life since he was 17. He hit the floor and did not get up. The first and second were still moving. What happened next did not have a word in any language I had been taught. It happened beneath language, in the place the bond occupied, in the instinctive animal knowledge that had been building between us across 7 nights of proximity and confrontation and truth. She pivoted left. I moved right without looking at her. She drove the second fighter toward the wall. I cut off his retreat before the thought had fully formed. He had nowhere to go. She took him down with a strike to the throat and a knee to the temple that put him on the stone floor, and turned in the same motion toward the first, who had recovered and whose blade was moving, toward her back. The wolf took over entirely. I was across the room before the movement registered as decision. The blade meant for her caught me across the ribs instead, a shallow cut, burning and bright, and I drove my elbow into the man's face with enough force to send him back into the wall, head cracking against stone. He slid to the floor and stayed there. Silence crashed down over the room like a physical weight. Both of us breathing hard. 3 bodies on the floor, none dead. I had held that back, operating on the slim margin of professional restraint, because alive men could be questioned. The bond between us was a roaring, luminous thing, as though the violence had stripped away whatever subtle dampening ordinary circumstances imposed and left it exposed and vivid and completely undisguisable. Serafina turned. She saw the blood first. A spreading dark stain through my shirt, below my left arm, longer than I had initially registered. She crossed the distance between us before I could speak, reaching without asking permission, pulling the fabric aside to see the wound. Her hands were very steady. Shallow, she said. But it needs pressure. I know how wounds work, I said. Then stop standing there performing invulnerability and hold this. She pressed a folded piece of cloth, torn from the hem of her own shirt, quickly and efficiently, against the cut and moved my hand to it. Her fingers closed around mine for a moment to ensure the pressure was correct, and the contact sent a current through the bond so sharp that I felt it in my back teeth. She felt it too. Her breath caught, barely audible. Neither of us moved for a moment. In the strange silence left by violence, with 3 unconscious men on the floor and blood drying on cold stone and the bond between us stripped raw by everything that had just happened, we stood close enough that her exhale fogged faintly in the chill air between us. "You stepped in front of the blade," she said. "It was expedient." "It was not expedient," she said. "It was the opposite of expedient. Losing the Alpha King to a shallow stab wound because he chose to take a hit on behalf of his prisoner would be categorically inadvisable." "You're not my prisoner," I said. It came out with more conviction than I had intended, and less equivocation. She looked at me. "What am I then?" she asked quietly. The bond answered. I did not yet. I looked down at the men on the floor, cataloging their clothing, the cut of their blades, the particular technique the third had used, familiar in a way that sat uneasily in the back of my mind. "Who sent them?" she asked, reading the direction of my focus. "That is what I intend to find out." I straightened, and the movement pulled at the wound, which I ignored. "These are not contract fighters." The footwork on the third was guard-trained. Someone inside this fortress arranged this. Serafina's expression did not change, but something sharpened behind it. Aldrich. Possibly. Or someone acting on his behalf who understood that delaying the Elder Council while revisiting settlement records means his window is closing. I looked at her steadily. "He cannot know exactly what I've found, but he knows the direction I'm moving. He decided eliminating me was cleaner than facing a formal inquiry," she said. Flat. Factual. Yes. She absorbed this with the composure of someone who had already made peace with the possibility of her death and was therefore less disturbed by its confirmation than most would be. That composure, which I had initially read as coldness, I now understood as a particular kind of courage. The kind that is not the absence of fear but the refusal to be governed by it. The wolf was still close to the surface. I was managing it, but only barely. The sight of the blade moving toward her back had done something to my control that I was still in the process of accounting for. The bond, already vivid from the combat, had surged into something territorial and absolute at that moment. Not the steady recognition of previous nights, but something older and more primal and considerably less interested in nuance. What? I had held it then. I was still holding it, but it was a near thing. I crossed to the door and called down to the lower guards, issuing orders with the clipped efficiency of a man who has handled crises often enough that the procedural response is automatic. The men on the floor were to be secured, separately, and held for questioning. The tower guard was to be doubled immediately. A full fortress security review before dawn. 2 of my most senior men posted at this door personally. When I turned back, Serafina was leaning against the table with her arms folded, watching me with an expression I could not entirely read. "You should have the wound seen to properly," she said. "I will." I didn't move toward the door. She waited. "The bond?" I said. "When he raised the blade behind you." "I know," she said quietly. "I felt what happened." "What did you feel?" She considered, with the careful honesty she applied to everything. "The bond pulling in one direction and then," she stopped. "Something tearing. Like a thread pulled past its tolerance." She met my eyes. It frightened me more than the blade did. The admission cost her something. I could see it in the slight tightening around her expression. The small surrender of a person who keeps their own counsel releasing something against their instinct. "You were frightened for me," I said. "I was frightened by the bond," she corrected, but the correction was too quick to be fully convincing, and we both heard it. The night was beginning to gray at the window's edge. In a few hours the fortress would be fully awake. Ruel would have reports from the overnight security review. The 3 men on the floor would be conscious and either talking or demonstrably unwilling to, which would itself be information. The day would bring consequences and decisions in the ordered sequence of practical urgency. But for this moment, we were still in the aftermath, standing in a tower room made close by violence and honesty and the searing, undeniable vividness of a bond that had just survived its first real test. I looked at her and let myself see, without the careful filtering of the preceding days, what was there to be seen. A woman who had given up a life she believed in because she could not close her eyes to what it was costing the people it was supposed to protect. Who had planned for her own death and chosen, instead, to survive long enough to be heard. who had fought with everything she had on a cliffside, in a tower room, in every conversation between them, and who had done it without cruelty, with precision, with purpose, with a loyalty to something more than herself. My soul had recognized her before my mind had caught up. It was catching up now. I moved toward the door. "Orion," she said. I stopped. "Thank you," she said. "Oh, simply." "Don't," I said. "Not yet." I descended the tower stairs and walked back through the covered walkway as the sky above the frost peaks began its slow, bruised transition from black to the pale gray that preceded dawn. The crescent mark was burning steadily over my heart, and the wolf was still pressed close to the surface, and somewhere in the back of my mind the decision that had been assembling itself across 7 nights and 1 assassination attempt and 17 names pressed into stone-cold administrative documents had finally, quietly, completely arrived. By mid-morning, the full royal guard had been assembled in the main courtyard. It was not a scheduled address. I had sent word through Davin, who had passed it through proper channels with a particular phrasing that communicated urgency without explanation. By the time I descended from the war chamber and walked out into the courtyard, the stone bowl of it was filled, warriors in full garrison dress, advisors, castle staff who had heard the assembly call and emerged from habit or curiosity, citizens from the inner ward who could see over the lower wall. The elders stood in their customary position at the right edge of the assembly space. Aldrich among them, expression composed, eyes very still. I did not go to the speaking position immediately. I went to the Moonstone Tower. The door opened before I reached it, my men having been briefed that I was coming. I climbed the stairs for what I had understood, walking across the courtyard, would be the last time as a man in this particular unresolved position. Serafina looked at me when I entered and read the assembly noise filtering up from below and understood what it meant without requiring explanation. "You're certain?" she said. "Yes." She held my gaze for a long moment. "The elders will challenge it." "Yes." "The pack may divide." "Some of it," I said. "For a time." "And you're certain anyway," she said. "Not a question this time. A confirmation." "I am." She stood, and for a moment the morning light caught her silver hair and the faint shimmer of the crescent mark in the entirety of who she was, unbroken, honest, inconvenient, necessary, and I thought again of the cliff, of the blade at her throat, of how close I had come to ending the one thing the realm actually needed. I offered her my arm. She looked at it for a half-second, the only hesitation she allowed herself, and then took it. We descended together. The courtyard fell silent when we emerged into the light. The kind of silence that is not peace but held breath, hundreds of people simultaneously suspending ordinary sound to understand what they were seeing. I felt the weight of it land and remained steady under it as I had always been steady under weight. I walked her to the center of the courtyard. Stopped. Released her arm and turned to face the assembly. "You know who she is?" I said. I did not use the title. "You know what she did. You know I hunted her across 3 weeks and 2 blizzards with every intention of executing her under pack law. I let that settle. Last night, someone sent trained fighters into the Moonstone Tower to kill her before that process could reach its conclusion. Before the full evidence of what she discovered could be examined. Before the council could be held accountable for what it has done to the outer settlements under the cover of my authority." Pause. "The attempt failed. I want that to be very clearly understood. It failed." Aldrich's composure had not broken, but the stillness of it had changed quality. "What is also clearly understood," I said, "is the crescent mark you can see at her collarbone, and the one you may not have seen at mine, and what they mean. You know the law of the bond. You know that it is not a human law, not written in council chambers or elder assembly. It is older than every law in our code. It is the moon goddess herself, and it does not make mistakes." I turned to Serafina. The bond roared to life between us, not quietly now, not the ember of the preceding days, but fully and completely itself, silver light spreading from the crescent mark at my chest, mirrored from hers, the luminous thread connecting us becoming visible to everyone present in the pale winter light of the courtyard. Gasp. A rolling murmur that moved through the crowd like wind through snow. "Serafina Vale," I said, and my voice carried to every corner of the stone bowl, to the battlements and the towers and the inner ward where citizens pressed close to hear. "By blood and bond, beneath the eyes of the moon goddess and the full witness of the Frost Peak pack, I claim you. As my mate. As my equal. As the person the universe itself has written into my soul. The silence that followed was absolute. Then the courtyard erupted. Shock first, pure, unanimous, the kind that precedes any other response. Then, beneath it, the fracture lines appearing in real time as the pack divided along the fault of what they had each decided, in the preceding weeks, to believe. Warriors who had served with her before the rebellion, a small number but visible, went very still in a way that was not protest. Others, veterans of the campaigns against the rebel, faces rigid with something between fury and disbelief. Elders staring at me with varying proportions of outrage and calculation. Aldrich took one step forward. I looked at him directly. He stopped. "The council will be addressed," I said, quietly enough that only those nearest heard it, and with enough precision that he understood it for what it was. Not a threat. A statement of the near future. He did not step back. But he did not step forward again. Beside me, Serafina stood with her chin lifted and her eyes moving across the crowd with the particular quality of a person absorbing impact without being broken by it. Taking the measure of what the division meant and what it would require. Already thinking, already planning, already carrying the weight with the competent steadiness of someone who chose her battles and won the one she chose. The bond blazed between us, visible, undeniable, ancient and bright in the winter morning light. Around us, the pack fractured and held its breath and waited to see what an alpha who had chosen destiny over law would do next. I was already ready to show them. Chapter 8. They came for me 2 days after the claiming. I had expected it. The elders did not move impulsively, that was both their strength and their limitation. They gathered evidence, consulted precedent, allowed the initial shock of a situation to settle into something they could approach with the formal weight their authority required. Elder Marin, the oldest among them and the one whose mastery of pack law was most comprehensive, had spent those 2 days in the archive. I knew because Sessa told me, and Sessa knew because she watched the archive the way a hawk watches open ground. They were building their case. So was I. The summons arrived on the morning of the 3rd day, written in the formal cadence of elder address, precise, traditional, and carrying beneath its measured language the unmistakable quality of an ultimatum. My presence was requested in the elder chamber at the 2nd hour. The matter of the Alpha Bond claim and the continued imprisonment of the Midnight Rebel required formal resolution before the law of the Frost Peak Pact could be considered upheld. I read it twice, folded it, set it down on the war table beside the settlement records and the council ledgers and the secondary evidence Ruel had spent 4 days organizing into a documented record that could withstand every challenge an experienced elder could construct. I was ready. The elder chamber occupied the deepest level of the fortress's original structure, predating my father's reign, predating his father's, built in the founding era when the pack had first established itself in the Frost Peaks and the men and women who codified its laws had wanted that codification to feel permanent. The walls were old stone, dense and cold, hung with the preserved records of every law ever passed in this realm. The table at the chamber's center was a single piece of ancient timber, dark with age, scarred by generations of hands pressing documents against it. The chairs around it were carved with the sigils of the 5 elder lineages. When I entered, all 5 were seated. Aldrich was not among them. He had been relieved of council duties quietly, 2 days prior, pending formal inquiry. He had not resisted, which meant either he had not yet grasped the full scope of what I had documented, or he had grasped it completely and was already calculating his next position. Either way, his absence from this room was deliberate, because his presence would have complicated the elders' ability to frame this as a matter of principle rather than self-interest. They were smarter than that. Elder Marin spoke first. She was a small woman who had been ancient for as long as I could remember, with a voice that had the quality of something that had been refined by long use into pure precision. No excess, no warmth, no ornamentation. Just the exact words required to convey the exact meaning intended. Alpha Veilblood, she said. We have convened in accordance with Pack Law, Article 47, which governs formal challenge to an alpha's fitness to rule when actions taken by that alpha conflict with the sacred legal code. We are here to hear your account and render a determination. I understand the article, I said. I sat down at the head of the table, my customary position in this room, and placed the leather document satchel on the table in front of me without opening it yet. Then you understand, Marin continued, that the public claiming of a prisoner convicted of treason, insurrection, and the killing of Royal Guard members constitutes a direct violation of Article 12, which prohibits the Alpha from using the bond claim to circumvent established legal process. Serafina Vale has not been convicted of anything, I said. She has been imprisoned pending judgment. There is a distinction. Pause. Elder Verith, the youngest of the five and the one most likely to be persuadable if any of them were, glanced briefly at his colleagues before returning his gaze to me. The distinction is technical, Marin said. Law is technical, I replied. By design. You taught me that yourself, Elder Marin, in this room, when I was 19 years old and had just inherited a throne and was inclined towards sweeping decisions. You told me precision is the difference between justice and vengeance. I have been precise. I would ask the same of this council. The silence that followed had a particular quality, the recalibrating silence of people who had expected a different kind of opponent and were adjusting their approach. Marin's expression did not change. The claim stands before the pack regardless of the legal technicality. You have created a political reality that demands resolution. The pack is divided. The law is challenged. This chamber requires you to choose. Between what precisely? I said. State it fully. Another small pause. Then Marin said, with the clean clarity of someone who had decided that directness served better than architecture, between the throne and the rebel. The words hung in the cold air of the chamber. The bond claim cannot be undone, Elder Verith said carefully. It was the closest any of them had come to acknowledging the sacred dimension of the situation. We are not asking you to undo it. We are asking whether you intend to pursue formal Luna investiture for a woman who stands accused under pack law. Because if you do, the law as written does not permit it, and the authority of this chamber requires us to formally challenge your fitness to continue as Alpha. The challenge to Alpha fitness was the nuclear option in pack governance. It had been invoked twice in recorded history and had produced, on both occasions, a transition of power. The elders knew that. I knew that. They were telling me that they would use it. I looked at each of them in turn. Marin, Verith. The other three, whose expressions contained varying proportions of personal conviction and political discomfort. These were not corrupt men and women in the manner Aldrich was corrupt. They were people who believed genuinely in the structure they had spent their lives upholding, who experienced the current situation as a genuine threat to the integrity of the system they served, and who were proceeding from that belief with the particular ruthlessness of people who consider themselves to be on the right side of a principle. I would like 24 hours, I said. Marin's eyes narrowed slightly. For what purpose? To present the full settlement records, the council ledger evidence, and the documented account of the assassination attempt to this chamber for review, I said. Before any determination is made regarding my fitness to rule or the legal status of Serafina Vale, this chamber should understand the complete picture of what her actions were responding to and what has been conducted under the authority of this pack's law in the outer territories for 7 years. The room was very still. That evidence, I continued, does not bear on the Article 47 question directly, but it bears on the nature of justice in this realm, and I would ask the elders to receive it before rendering a verdict that history will be required to evaluate. Marin looked at me for a long moment. 24 hours, she said. This chamber will reconvene tomorrow at the 2nd hour. I collected the satchel and left. She was at the window when I arrived at the tower that afternoon, as she sometimes was in daylight hours, watching the mountains with the particular attention of someone for whom the outside world had become primarily theoretical. How did the elders receive it? She asked without turning. They granted a delay. I closed the door behind me. They will convene tomorrow. She turned then, and I saw that she had been thinking. There was a particular quality to her stillness when she had been thinking for an extended period. A compression, as though the internal activity had drawn energy inward and left the surface very quiet. I want to propose something, she said. No. She blinked. You don't know what I'm going to say. You're going to offer to exile yourself, I said. To remove the legal and political complexity of your presence by removing your presence. You've been constructing the argument since the claiming, and this is the first opportunity you've had to present it directly. I held her gaze. The answer is no. The slight parting of her lips, a response arrested before it could form, told me I had been correct. It is the most pragmatic solution, she said, after a pause that contained the visible process of rerouting. My exile removes the council's leverage. It preserves your authority. It allows the Aldrich inquiry to proceed on its own terms without the complication of my presence framing every decision you make as personal rather than principled. The pack stabilizes. You continue the reforms. She said it with the same precision she brought to everything, clean, logical, the best version of the argument. I am asking you to consider the mathematics of it. I've considered them. And the mathematics of exile do not account for the bond, I said. Or for the 17 names. Or for the fact that you spent 4 years trying to fix this through the correct channels before you were left without any, and that the correct response to that history is not for you to disappear so that everyone can be comfortable again. I paused. You did not fight for comfort. I will not negotiate for it. She looked at me steadily. You would give up the throne. I would redefine what the throne is. That is a meaningful distinction to you, she said. It will not be a meaningful distinction to the elders. Not yet, I agreed. That is what tomorrow is for. She crossed her arms. The self-containment gesture I had learned to read is not coldness but the physical management of feeling that was too large for the space she had been trained to allow it. She looked at me with those storm-gray eyes that had been reading me since the cliff, that had been patient and honest and more perceptive than was always comfortable, and something in her expression shifted into a register I had seen only once before. In the tower room when I had knelt, the unguarded flash of something not yet ready to be named. You understand, she said quietly, that if this fails, if the elders invoke Article 47 and succeed, you lose everything. The throne. The pack's loyalty. The ability to implement any of the reforms, to hold Aldrich accountable, to change any of the things the settlement records demand be changed. The only version in which any of that happens is the version in which you remain alpha. I know. And you're going to do this anyway. I'm going to do this because of those reasons, I said. Not in spite of them. Because an alpha who can be made to abandon his mate and bury legitimate justice under political convenience to preserve his own reign is not the king this pack needs him to be. And the pack, whatever portion of it is currently outraged, knows it too, even if it doesn't know it knows it yet. The silence that followed was different from all the others. Softer. More complete. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said very quietly, don't lose. The full moon assembly convened at dusk the following day. I had called it myself. The elders had expected a private chamber proceeding. I had sent word that the matter would be addressed before the full pack at the assembly stone, the ancient carved granite platform in the outer courtyard where, by tradition, the most significant decisions in pack history had been made and witnessed. No private rooms, no closed councils, no determination rendered away from the people it would govern. If my reign ended tonight, it would end in full view of every person it had claimed to serve. The courtyard was filled beyond capacity. Inner ward, outer ward, the lower settlement residents who had received word through the afternoon and arrived in the cold dusk in their hundreds, pressing close to the walls and the walkways to see. Torches lined the assembly space, burning against the falling dark. Above us, the full moon climbed through a sky that had cleared after days of cloud, enormous and blue-white, flooding the frost peaks in its particular cold brilliance. The elders stood to my right. Serafina stood to my left. I had asked her to stand there. She had not argued. Elder Marin had clearly wanted to argue with the venue change but had understood, with the political acuity of a woman who had survived 3 reigns, that objecting publicly to transparency would not improve her position. I waited until the assembly had reached a quiet that was not peace. Then I spoke. I did not begin with the bond. I began with the thornwood. I presented the settlement record findings not in the dry administrative language of a council briefing but in plain words, what the formulae meant in practice, what the ledger discrepancies amounted to in the lives of the people they governed, who had known and for how long, what had been done to suppress the reports that should have surfaced it. I named Aldrich. I presented the evidence without embellishment and without mercy. I watched the pack hear it. There is a particular quality to collective understanding arriving in real time, a shift in the quality of stillness, hundreds of people simultaneously revising their framework for something they thought they already knew. I had governed these people. Many of them had trusted my counsel with the same unconditional deference I had given it myself. Hearing that trust had been exploited, not by me but through me, produced something complicated in the crowd. Not simple anger. Something closer to grief with a hard edge. Then I spoke about the law. Article 12 was written to prevent the bond claim from being used as a legal shield, I said. It was written in good faith, by people who understood that love can become cover for injustice if it is not examined. That principle is sound. I let that settle. Serafina Vale disrupted supply routes, freed prisoners condemned without due process, and organized sustained resistance against an instrument of governance that had been corrupted. She tried to bring that corruption forward through legitimate means and was deliberately blocked by the men responsible for the corruption. I looked out at the assembled faces. She was right. She was right about what was happening, right about what it required, and right that no one in authority was willing to see it. Pause. She was also in violation of pack law. Both of those things are true. What this assembly must understand tonight is that the law she violated was being enforced by the same apparatus that created the crisis she was responding to. And that a legal code which cannot examine itself, which demands compliance without accounting for the conditions compliance is required within, is not a code that serves the pack. It is a code that serves itself. I heard the first murmur of response from the crowd. Not a single register, divergent, the fracture lines of 2 days ago still present. But something else too in the voices of the outer ward residents, the lower settlement families who had come in from the cold to stand here. Something that sounded like listening. Pack law must be strong, I said. It must be clear and it must be enforced and it cannot be treated as optional when it becomes inconvenient. I believe that as completely as I have ever believed anything. I looked at the elders. And pack law must be just. Not just in its original intention. Just in its application, in its ongoing examination, in its willingness to be revised when the evidence of its effects demands revision. I let my gaze move across the assembly. Strength without compassion is not leadership. It is tyranny with good documentation. The silence that followed was not the silence of held breath. It was the silence of something landing. I will not choose between the throne and my mate, I said. Not because I place personal loyalty above governance, but because the false choice itself is the problem. A king who cannot integrate justice and loyalty, law and humanity, strength and care, that king has already failed regardless of which option he selects. I looked at Marin directly. I will govern this pack. I will enforce its laws. I will hold every person who corrupted those laws accountable in full. And I will do it with Serafina Vale as my Luna, because she saw what I did not see, she fought for what I failed to protect. And she is exactly the kind of conscience this throne has been missing. Elder Marin rose from her seat. The courtyard went very still. She was a small woman, and the full moon made her a silver silhouette. She looked at me across the assembly space with the ancient, careful expression of someone measuring a decision that will outlast them. The sacred code, she said, does not provide for this. Then we will rewrite the sacred code, I said. As it has been rewritten before when the law served something less than justice. That is not the destruction of the code. That is the code working as it was intended to work. Another silence. Longer this time. Then Elder Vareth quietly stood. He did not speak. He simply stood. After a moment, the second elder stood. Then the third. Marin looked at her 4 colleagues. Then, with the slow deliberateness of a woman who has not been wrong often and knows it, she looked back at me. She sat down. Not agreement, perhaps. Not yet. But the challenge to alpha fitness was not raised. The Article 47 proceedings did not commence. The door she could have forced open tonight remained, by the decision of her silence, closed. In the crowd, the fracture was still visible. The outrage was real and would not dissolve overnight. Division had been promised and division was present, hot and uncomfortable and entirely genuine in the people who felt it. But in the outer ward, where the lower settlement families stood packed in the cold, something else was happening. I saw it move through them, slowly, carefully, like the first melt at the edge of frozen ground. Not celebration. Something quieter and more durable than celebration. Recognition. Beside me, Serafina had not moved or spoken. She stood with her chin level and her eyes open and the crescent mark burning silver in the moonlight, and she was the same person she had always been. Unbroken, honest, inconveniently necessary, but she was standing here, in the center of the assembly that had nearly witnessed her execution, and the throne had not chosen against her. The moon climbed higher. The realm held its breath. And the sacred code of the Frost Peak Pack, 300 years old, waited to be made into something the people it governed could actually live inside. I had work to do. We both did. Chapter 9. The fracture did not heal overnight. I had not expected it to. Wounds of that depth, political, historical, structural, do not close on the strength of a single speech beneath a full moon, however well the speech lands. They close through time and evidence and the slow accumulation of proof that the new shape of things is more trustworthy than the old one. I understood that. I had governed long enough to know the difference between the moment a thing changes and the moment people are willing to believe it has changed, and that the distance between those two moments is where the hardest work lies. In the days that followed the assembly, the fortress divided along the lines that had been forming since the cliff. Senior warriors who had served longest under the old codes, men whose loyalty to pack law was genuinely foundational, not cynical, withdrew their direct counsel without formally withdrawing their service. They performed their duties. They did not defect. But their eyes when they passed me in the corridors held a reserve they had not carried before, a watchfulness, as though they were waiting to see what manner of king I became before they recommitted fully. I respected that. It was the correct response from men of principle confronted with a significant change. I had done the same myself across 20 years of governance, withheld full trust until evidence warranted it. I would not now demand the immediate deference I had not instantly given. There were others who did not respond with reserve. 3 senior captains submitted formal requests for reassignment to outer garrison posts within the first week, citing loss of confidence in the direction of Central Command. I granted all 3 requests without prejudice, noted them for the record, and assigned their posts to officers who had served in the eastern and southern border territories, men and women who had spent their careers at the outer edges of the realm and who understood what the settlement records described from direct experience rather than administrative abstraction. Aldrich was formally charged on the 8th day. The evidence Ruel had compiled was presented to a tribunal of 3 independent PAC legal officers, none of them council-appointed, all of them drawn from the outer judiciary that Aldrich's administrative apparatus had never managed to fully penetrate. The tribunal reviewed the records for 4 days and returned a unanimous finding of systematic misappropriation and deliberate suppression of material evidence. Sentencing proceedings were scheduled. He did not look at me when the finding was read. I looked at him. I wanted to see if there was anything in him that resembled the men who had trusted my governance and paid for it with their winter margins and their children's lives. I did not find it. What I found instead was the compressed, inward expression of a man calculating consequences, not confronting them but calculating them. Finding the angles, I turned away. The outer settlements received the first emergency supplement distribution on the 6th day, authorized by my direct order, drawn from the central stores that the falsified assessments had been funneling into administrative surplus for years. I sent Davin personally with a small guard and full documentation of what was being delivered and why. He returned 11 days later with reports that I read in full and alone, without summarizing them for the War Council. The accounts from the Thornwood settlement took me the longest to get through. I sat with those pages for a long time. Serafina had been moved from the Moonstone Tower on the morning after the assembly. I had arranged chambers in the eastern wing, comfortable, properly appointed, with a window that looked out over the frost peaks rather than the interior courtyard. She had examined them with the specific attentiveness of someone who has spent enough time in constrained spaces to notice the quality of air and light before anything else, and said nothing for a long moment. Then she had looked at me with the direct, unvarnished gaze I had come to structure parts of my thinking around, and asked what was expected of her. I told her I expected nothing. I told her she was free to move through the fortress as she chose, that the guard had been briefed, that any area she wanted access to would be made available to her. She had listened to all of this with a patience that was not passivity but consideration, and then asked, quietly, whether she might have access to the settlement reports as they came in from Davin. I had them copied for her daily. What I observed in the following weeks was not what I had anticipated, though it should not have surprised me. She did not rest. She had not, I was beginning to understand, a particular facility for resting. Not because she was incapable of it, but because 3 years of running a shadow campaign across the Frost Peaks had built her into a person who understood that the gap between a problem identified and a problem solved was filled entirely by sustained work, and she was constitutionally unable to stand in that gap without moving through it. She met with the 3 captains I had reassigned from outer territories, not formally, not on my arrangement, simply by the natural convergence of people who had operated in the same landscape and shared its specific knowledge. She sat with Sessa for 6 hours one afternoon and emerged with a set of proposed revisions to the tithe assessment methodology that were more technically sophisticated than anything my counsel had produced in a decade. She did not present these to me as a subordinate presenting work for approval. She spread them on the war table one evening and talked me through them the same way she had talked me through the settlement records in the tower, directly, precisely, with the embedded assumption that I was capable of following the argument and would engage with it honestly if I disagreed. I disagreed with 3 of the provisions on technical governance grounds and said so. She reconsidered them overnight and revised 2 of them. The third, she defended so effectively at our next conversation that I revised my objection instead. She did not remark on that. I did not either. But the crescent mark over my heart, which had been burning with varying intensity since the cliff, settled during those evenings into something steadier and warmer than it had yet managed. The specific warmth not of a bond pulling toward union but of something already in union and simply, quietly, glowing with it. The Luna ceremony was set for the first full moon following the assembly. The tradition of Luna investiture was ancient, older than the current fortress, older than most of the laws whose revision was now underway. In its original form it was simple: the alpha, the mate, the moon, and the full witness of the pack. No elaborate ritual, no extended ceremony. The bond did not require performance. It required presence. What it also required, technically, was the elder endorsement, a formal recognition that the chosen Luna was of sound character and fit standing to hold the role. This provision had originally been included to prevent reckless claims made in youth or poor judgment, and Elder Marin, who had not spoken publicly in the days since the assembly beyond the required administrative communications, had sent me a written note on the 5th day that contained 3 sentences. The first acknowledged the Article 47 question as resolved without formal challenge. The second noted that the Elder Council would review the proposed sacred code revisions in formal session before the Luna ceremony. The third said, without preamble or qualification, she is capable of the role. I read the third sentence several times. Then I folded the note and placed it in the document satchel where I kept the things that mattered enough to keep. The night before the ceremony, I found Serafina in the corridor outside the eastern wing, standing at a narrow window that looked north toward the highest ridgeline of the frost peaks. The moon was already rising, a day from full, enormous and deliberate in its ascent. She stood very still in the way she sometimes did when she thought she was unobserved. Not the compressed stillness of someone managing feeling, but an open stillness, simply present in the moment without requiring it to be anything other than what it was. I stopped beside her without speaking. After a while she said, I used to navigate by this range, the northern ridgeline. When visibility dropped to nothing in a blizzard and compass readings were unreliable, you could still sometimes see the highest peak, just the outline of it against the sky. Enough to orient yourself. You spent 3 winters in those mountains, I said. Most of them. Pause. I know every pass above the treeline and 4 routes that don't appear on your maps. They appear on them now, I said. I had them added. She turned slightly to look at me, and the faint curve at the corner of her mouth was not a full smile but was adjacent to one, the specific expression she permitted herself when something struck her as both unexpected and apt. You're trying to tell me something, she said. I'm telling you that this realm has been missing significant cartographic data, I said. I am correcting that. The almost smile held. We stood at the window in companionable silence for a while, watching the moon climb. Below us, the fortress went about its evening routines, the sounds of it familiar and continuous, the machinery of a living place that had survived upheaval before and was in the process of surviving this one. Are you frightened? I asked. She considered. Of tomorrow? Of what it means? What comes after? She was quiet for a moment that was not evasion but genuine thought. I am aware, she said carefully, of the size of what has been set in motion. The reforms. The code revisions. The Pax division that is still more open wound than scar. The outer settlements and everything they still need. She paused. I am not frightened of the work. I have never been frightened of the work. Another pause, quieter. I am sometimes frightened of being insufficient for it. It was the most unguarded thing she had said to me. More unguarded than her anger, more unguarded even than the moment in the tower when she had admitted fear for me, because this one reached below the competence and the discipline and the careful management of her own exposure and touched something that had no armor on it. I turned to face her fully. You are the only person I have encountered in 20 years of governance, I said, who saw clearly what needed to be seen, said clearly what needed to be said, and was willing to carry the cost of both without asking anyone else to pay it first. I held her gaze. I have been running a realm. You have been trying to run it correctly. Those are not the same thing, and I needed the difference explained to me at the edge of a cliff by someone prepared to die for it. Pause. You are not insufficient. You are exactly what this is. She looked at me for a long time. Then she reached up, briefly, and pressed her fingers against the crescent mark over my heart, not through fabric this time but against the skin above my collar, where the mark had been faintly visible since the cliff. The bond blazed between us, not urgently, not demanding, but warm and complete and entirely certain of itself. Tomorrow then, she said. Tomorrow, I agreed. The ceremony took place at the assembly stone as the full moon reached its highest point. Snow fell. Not the violent, weaponized snow of the Frost Peak storms that had defined the preceding months. Not the blizzard that had chased us across the ridgeline on the night of the cliff confrontation. Not the cutting ice spray of the mountains at their most hostile. This was different. Soft, unhurried, enormous flakes drifting down from a sky that had been cloudless an hour before and had gathered these clouds from somewhere I could not account for, as though the night itself had decided to mark the occasion in its own way. The pack was gathered in its entirety. The division was still visible. It would be for months, possibly longer, but everyone had come. The warriors who had submitted reassignment requests. The elders, all 5 of them, Elder Marin in the center with her silver hair and her ancient, evaluating gaze. The outer ward families. The lower settlement residents who had made the journey in from the cold and who stood pressed along the far wall with the particular stillness of people who have spent years being peripheral to power and are not yet certain how to stand in its center. The 3 captains who had known Serafina in the 3rd Division stood together near the east wall. They had not been invited to any particular position. They had simply placed themselves there. I stood at the assembly stone. Serafina came through the fortress gates alone. She had not wanted an escort. I had understood that immediately, understood that arriving on her own terms, under her own motion, was not ceremony to her but the only honest version of what was happening. She was not being installed. She was choosing. The same way she had chosen everything else. She wore midnight velvet, darker than the battle garments from the cliff, cut without the combat practicality those had carried, draping instead with the kind of simple, deliberate elegance that did not require ornamentation. Her silver hair was unbound. The crescent mark at her collarbone shimmered with the particular luminous quality it had developed since the claiming, visible even at distance, drawing the eye the way the moon itself drew the eye, not by demanding attention but simply by being what it was. She crossed the assembly space without hurrying. She reached the stone and looked at me. The crowd was absolutely silent. Serafina Vale, I said, and my voice carried to every corner of the courtyard, to the battlements where guards stood watch, to the lower settlement families along the wall. You came to this realm as my enemy. You showed me what I could not see and paid for the showing with 3 years of your life and everything you had built within these walls. I held her gaze. You fought not to tear this pack apart but to put it back together more honestly than it had been. You were right and you were brave, and you were the instrument of the most significant reckoning this realm has faced in my lifetime. A pause in which the snow fell softly between us. The moon goddess does not make mistakes. She never has. She sent you to me, to this pack, because this is where you were needed and this is what you were made for. I reached for the Luna circlet, plain silver, no ornamentation, its simplicity the point, and held it between us. Will you stand here? I asked. Not as ceremony. As the question it actually was. She looked at me steadily. Yes, she said. Simply. Completely. I placed the circlet in her silver hair. The bond ignited. Not the slow, persistent warmth of recognition or the searing surge of the assassination attempt's aftermath. Something entirely different from either of those. It rose from both of us simultaneously, a silver light that began at the crescent marks and expanded outward, luminous and warm, filling the space between us and then moving past us, past the assembly stone, past the courtyard walls, spreading across the frost peaks in a wave of cold silver radiance that moved through the snowfall and illuminated the mountains from within. The crowd made a sound, a collective intake of breath, the involuntary response of hundreds of people witnessing something that operated outside the register of ordinary experience. The silver light was not metaphor. It was visible, moving, alive. The bond made external, the moon goddess's work rendered undeniable in full view of the entire pack. For a long moment, the mountains glowed. The snow fell through the light, each flake catching it and carrying it down, until the entire courtyard was filled with a soft luminescence that made the familiar architecture of the fortress seem briefly unfamiliar, remade freshly itself. Then, at the edge of the assembly, something moved. One of the outer ward families, a woman in the back, a child pressed against her side, went down to one knee. It was quiet, unremarkable, not performed for observation. Simply a woman and her child in the middle of the crowd, choosing to kneel. The man beside them followed. Then the family on their left. It moved through the outer ward like the silver light had moved through the mountains. Not a command, not a choreographed response, but a wave of individual decisions arriving in sequence, each one its own, each one building on the ones before it. From the outer ward it spread inward, through the lower settlement families, through the garrison staff, through the mid-rank warriors who had spent the preceding weeks in watchful suspension. It was not unanimity. The 3 captains who had submitted reassignment requests remained standing. A cluster of senior warriors near the east gate did not kneel. I noted them and did not mark them. Dissent rendered honestly was more trustworthy than compliance rendered through pressure, and I would need people around me capable of honest dissent. But the assembly stone was surrounded by kneeling, and the light was still moving through the mountains, and the snow was falling softly on all of it, on the kneeling and the standing, on the elders and the outer ward families, on the crescent marks burning silver at 2 chests, on a realm that had been at war with itself and was in the process of deciding what it wanted to become. Elder Marin did not kneel. She rose from her elder seat, very slowly, and looked at me across the assembly space with the ancient, careful gaze of a woman who has watched power operate long enough to distinguish between the kind that wears itself out and the kind that endures. Then she inclined her head. It was a small gesture. It was not a small thing. Seraphina's fingers found mine at my side. Not a performance, not ceremony, simply the natural movement of 2 people standing at the center of something enormous and choosing to stand there together. Her hand was cold from the winter air and entirely steady. I held it. The silver light faded slowly from the peaks, leaving the mountains their ordinary luminous selves beneath the full moon, vast and cold and indifferent in their geological way, yet carrying in their stone and ice the residue of something that had moved through them. Something that would not easily be forgotten. The snow continued to fall. Soft, unhurried, enormous flakes drifting down through torchlight and moonlight and the quieting crowd that I looked at the woman beside me, at the Luna circlet in her silver hair and the crescent mark shimmering at her collarbone and the expression on her face that was not triumph and not relief and not quite peace, but was something in the direction of all 3, the specific and hard-won quality of a person who has carried something enormous for a long time and set it down, at last, in the right place. She looked back at me. The work begins tomorrow, she said. It began on a cliff, I said. We are simply further into it. The faintest curve touched her mouth. Around us, the Frost Peak realm breathed. The pact that had fractured was not healed. Healing was a longer process than a ceremony, longer than a speech beneath a full moon, longer than silver light moving through mountains. But it was in motion now, oriented toward something it had not been oriented toward before. Something that required not only strength, which it had always had, but the willingness to examine what the strength was in service of, and to change the answer when the answer had become wrong. That was the work. That had always been the work. The moon stood full and brilliant over the frost peaks, bearing witness as it had borne witness to everything that had come before. The hunt, the cliff, the tower, the trial, the claiming, patient and ancient and entirely unconcerned with whether the people beneath it were ready for what was required of them. They never were, fully. They never needed to be. They only needed to begin. When destiny defies tradition, should love bow to law? Or should kings rewrite history for their queen? Drop your thoughts in the comment section. Also comment where you are watching from and don't forget to like, share this story and subscribe to this channel for more stories every day. Thank you.